Have you spent a significant amount of time living outside your passport country during your developmental years? Do you come from an expat, military, diplomat, missionary, or international business family background? If so, then this podcast is for you.
Welcome to the TCK Research Podcast, where we discuss the current state of research on third culture kids, cross-culture kids, expat families, and international life in general.
My name is Andrea Schmidt, and I've been an expat for over 30 years, having lived in a total of 9 countries. I'm a coach for TCK girls, and I'm currently completing my master's degree in psychology.
And I'm Mathieu Gagnon, an adult third culture kid who grew up in 6 countries until the age of 15. And I'm now a professor of psychology in Ontario, Canada.
Every episode, we bring you a fascinating conversation with a leading researcher in the field.
If you're listening on YouTube or another platform, please subscribe to our channel. And if you enjoyed this episode, please press the thumbs up or like button, share it on your social media platforms, or send it to a friend.
If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can reach us at tckresearchpod@gmail.com.
Let's jump right in.
Enjoy the podcast.
Today's guest is Dr. Chloé Donohue, counseling psychologist and founder of Donohue Consulting, psychotherapist, and third culture kid researcher. And this episode is about her paper entitled Growing Up as a Third Culture Kid and its impact on identity and belonging, published in 2022 in Counselling Psychology Review. Okay, Chloé Donohue, welcome to our third episode of the TCK Research podcast. I have to right away ask, as a French speaker, and Andrea can see me coming a mile away because I've annoyed her with this. I'm very specific with words.
Yes, you have.
You have an accent aigu, not right now on your name, but in some signatures you have an accent aigu. So is it Chloe or Chloé?
You know, it's interesting that you bring that up. It's Chloe. And I have no French connection that I'm aware of, but my parents wanted the accent and we did it. But funny anecdote on that is that when I was growing up, I used to call it the accident. So I'd say, oh, you know,
oh my gosh.
The
so
accident.
it's Chloe with accident on the E.
So that was, Andrea was right. That was Andrea's hypothesis, right? That it was the parents who wanted to make something kind of exotic. And I was like, no. There must be a reason why there's an accent aigu. She must have a French connection somewhere.
Deep point for me.
Yes. Okay, so we've gotten that out of the way. So you are a, let me see if I got this right. Well, you're many things, of course, but you are today's guest, of course, but you're also a registered counseling psychologist and registered psychotherapist, member of the British Association for Counseling and Psychotherapy. You got your PhD, I believe, from Roehampton University. Where is that? Roehampton University?
University of Roehampton is in South London, Southwest London.
Southwest London. Okay. Good. You're also a teacher. You're an author. You work directly with adult third culture kids, children third culture kids and their families. And you're also the founder of Donohue Consulting, which we will put the link to in our show notes, of course. And you also run an Instagram page, which I believe is at TCK Psychology. And we will link that as well to the show notes. So welcome aboard. Before we start, are there any other aspects of your description or identity that I missed there that you'd like to highlight?
No, I think you're very thorough on it. Yeah,
Thank you.
Perfectly.
Great.
Perfect. And the title of the paper for which we decided to we wanted to have you on, it's a paper that was published in 2022. in the Counselling Psychology Review Journal, which is a peer-reviewed journal. And it's a paper entitled Growing Up as a Third Culture Kid and Its Impact on Identity and Belonging. And before we go any further, just a note to the listeners. So we've had, if you've listened to our other episodes, we've had, we've interviewed someone who was doing qualitative research in the sense that she was really asking participants verbal kind of stories and trying to get some themes out of those surveys. We've had an episode where we had Magdalena Mosania, who was doing more quantitative research, where she really was measuring using numbers and numerical measurements, measuring how much people's identities are configured a certain way and their values and so on. And our guest today, Chloé Donohue, as the research we're talking about is a different kind of aspect of research, which is a systematic review, and which is a very important thing in science, because the idea here is to look at what's been published, put it all together, and try to get a sense of what's emerging as themes from many different papers. So it's an important part of the research aspect as well, and that's kind of why we wanted to have you on as well. So that's the little note for so listeners can kind of orient themselves here.
Yeah.
Yeah,
but before, it's very important, right? So we've got all that done, but before we jump in, we would like to hear a little bit more about your personal story, like in relationship with the concept of TCKs. And if you can tell us a little bit about your TCK journey, that would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. So my father holds an American passport, born and raised in the States, though his mother was Canadian. And my understanding is that she kind of naturalized to the States and ended up kind of dropping her Canadian citizenship and becoming American.
Okay.
And my mother is Venezuelan.
Okay.
And she was born and raised in Venezuela, I believe, up until the age of 16, and then she moved to the States. And so now she also has a passport. They work for international schools. So that's kind of what brought our family moving around. To this day, my mom still works in international schools, actually.
There you go.
They met in Venezuela at an international school there. But I myself was born in Ecuador while they were working there. We then moved to Romania and Thailand. And Thailand are probably where my memories are starting to begin. I don't really remember Ecuador or Romania. I was too young. From Thailand, we went to Sumatra, Indonesia. Was there 7 years. So when I think of my childhood, I think mostly around Indonesia, primary years. Then middle school, following Sumatra, we moved to Switzerland in Zurich. We stayed there.
Okay.
And I did my high school then. After Switzerland, we moved to Ghana. And I lived in Ghana for 5 years. And that is where I finished high school at LCS and Lincoln Community School. Then I went through the process that I think many third culture kids can kind of relate to, of which university and where do I go to, as someone who wanted to go to university. And I ended up living in the States then for the first time at 18.
Okay.
In university there. So despite being an American passport holder my entire life, I had never actually lived in the States until I was 18. I did my undergraduate at Allegheny College in Pennsylvania. And I think initially I had thought that I would stay in the States and kind of develop a professional career there. But upon graduation, I think I missed the international living. I missed the kind of third culture community, as I understand many do. And I took a year to do some kind of adventure related things. So I worked as a scuba
Mm-hmm.
diver for a while back
Oh,
in
wow.
Indonesia. Then decided I wanted to try and cycle the length of New Zealand, so I did that. And then at that point was when I had a bit of a moment and I thought, well, what do I really actually want to do here?
Mm.
Yeah.
And I think I did probably what many people do, and I followed the footsteps of my parents. So I actually got a job at
Oh,
international school in Japan.
In
okay.
Japan.
So I
Whereabouts in
lived
Japan?
in Nagoya.
Okay.
Okay.
An internship role as a teaching assistant, kind of supporting with additional needs in the
Mm-hmm.
primary school. So I did
Wow.
that for a year, realized I loved working with kids, I loved working with adolescents, but I was not a classroom teacher.
Mm-hmm.
I
Mm-hmm.
really respect people who can do that, but I just could not wrap my brain around all of that. And then after that is when I moved to the UK. And
Mm-hmm.
so I've been in the UK since for almost 7 years.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Interesting.
Okay, that's a long time for you, right? As a TCK, let's say. Yeah.
It is. It
Yeah.
is. And a lot of it has been related to education. So I did my master's in the UK, did my doctorate in the UK. So that's a good 4 or 5 years right there already.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
But I'm
And when you
still here.
went back to Indonesia, because personal question, because I lived in Indonesia for 8 years. Where did you do your scuba diving?
Um, Off the coast of Bali on a little
Ah, I
island,
thought so.
on a little island called Lombongan.
Okay, yes, 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 I know Limbonga. My daughter grew up in Bali. So
Oh,
yeah,
really?
I know
Amazing.
that area very, very well. Yeah,
Amazing.
It was
perfect.
an incredible time. I really
Yeah,
enjoyed
I
it.
can imagine. I can imagine.
So is the
Thank you so
UK
much.
dare I say, is it home now? What is it?
Ooh, loaded question, Mathieu. Right at the beginning.
Uh, you know what? I've actually, last month, I became, and I forget this because it's so fresh, I became British last month.
Oh my
Oh,
gosh.
So I'm a dual
okay.
citizen now, which is new.
Yeah.
Hence me forgetting to kind of mention it sooner.
Uh-huh.
I guess from that perspective, I have the passport. And actually, I've lived in the UK longer now than I ever did in the States. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
Right.
that side of it. But I don't see myself staying here forever.
Right.
Um, my husband is actually also a third culture kid,
Oh,
uh,
Oh,
okay.
that way. So I think we kind of have our eyes set on continuing the adventure. We don't know where
well,
or
it's
how.
But
that's
I can quote you before you said for the moment.
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you have a rich relationship to the topic of the paper, therefore, because the paper is, of course, on third culture kids and their sense of belonging and identity. And as I explained before, right, your main goal in this paper was to bring together, to synthesize the current scientific knowledge, the empirical knowledge of identity and belonging in TCKs, because these studies exist. There's not a lot of them, but of course, some do exist. And you wanted to bring them all together to provide a contribution, which is, if you take these studies together and you look at them, what emerges, what portrait emerges from that? And you wanted to provide a focused and practical understanding of the current issues that TCKs may face related to identity and related to belonging. Why this? I mean, I could easily come up with an answer, but I'd like to hear your version of it. Why was this particular topic important to you, and how did you become interested in it?
Yeah, there's a few different reasons. Some from a practical sense, but also some just thinking about where I kind of wanted to take it. On the practical side of things, it seems to be one of the more researched areas within third culture kids at the moment. And since I knew I wanted to do a systematic review, I think it was important to try and find an area where there was a bit more substance of kind of being quite a few different articles. An important, I think, note in all of this, actually, and kind of continuing on the discussion, is that this article started as the literature review for my doctoral thesis.
Right.
Oh, okay.
I was kind of thinking in the back of my mind is I knew I wanted for my doctoral work to study the more psychological aspect of third culture kids and the interpersonal relatedness of third culture kids. However, there's not a lot of research on that in third culture kids at the we're thinking of it strictly psychological mental health kind of perspective. Lots kind of relating and kind of adjacent and near to it, but not quite on it. So I needed the foundation somewhere. And when we look at non-third culture kid populations, what we do know and what the research shows is that actually different complexities with identity and different complexities with belonging will often kind of correlate or be connected to mental health difficulties, psychological well-being difficulties, and interpersonal difficulties as well. So knowing that that's kind of where I wanted to go in a wider kind of bigger scheme of things, I think it was important to go with a topic that could be related to that or could have an impact on and in an area that had some articles that I could kind of pull together and see what the themes are too. So that was the thought process.
Was there a sense while you were doing this that you probably know this in there's a kind of a running joke in psychology that all research is me search.
Me search, yeah.
Which is that people actually end up studying something that I believe it's kind of overplayed as a joke, but I guess I'm the classic case of that because I reoriented my career to basically trying to understand what the heck happened in my life. Was there a sense of you? Was there a part of you that felt this kind of closer connection than you would to a more kind of distant subject from your life experience?
Yeah, I think there's absolutely truth in that. I think you do tend to see that with researchers and them kind of being more interested in issues that in some shape or form relate to them. And I think what was really interesting was when I was first started this, I actually wrote an entire different literature review on a completely different topic that had nothing to do with third culture kids, but was more focused on child development.
Right.
And it wasn't until I had an assignment as a part of the doctorate process to kind of look at intersectionality.
There you go.
Like cultural intersectionality. And I hadn't even thought, I've known about third culture kids. My parents, I was lucky, they knew it was a thing, so I knew it was a thing from age, but I didn't really have any interest in it, oddly.
Yeah.
It just really come across. And so it wasn't until that assignment and I started to read some articles on it and I was like, this is so cool. I feel like it was so validating in so many ways to hear about what was going on and to see what was out there in the literature. Enough that I decided to do away with the other 10,000 words of the literature review and rewrite completely.
Yes.
Looking at exactly identity and belonging. So definitely something kind of pulled at me in terms of on a personal level of just finding it really fascinating. And I think the biggest word for me was actually validating.
Yes.
Yeah, can totally understand that.
Yeah, and that does come up later in the article as well in terms of what I found was being said with other articles, which is interesting too. But I think that was a big part of pushing me further into it.
Very interesting.
Thanks.
Very interesting.
And while you were carrying out your research, you synthesized the current research that you the all the papers that you found on TCK identity and belonging, and you used the method called the Prisma method. If you could explain that a little bit to us, and how you went from such a huge number to 6 papers you used in the end, right? And you can say the huge number because it's a surprising one.
It's quite astonishing, actually.
Right?
And it was really interesting because it's been a while since I've really looked at this paper. So in preparation for this, like, I need to go back and kind of look at it. And that captured my eye again and going,
Yeah, ours too.
6. But I think this is where the methodology becomes really interesting. And so the Prisma method is really a way of kind of screening different articles in a systematic way. And its approach to be used to kind of add some methodological rigor to a systematic review from the perspective of ensuring that I'm not just kind of typing in identity, belonging, third culture kids and just picking different ones that I feel like including based on I personally like the article, or maybe I know the person who wrote it, or that one tidbit is really fascinating. So the Prisma method is a way of kind of breaking through that and going onto all these different databases, typing in different keywords, which I did outline in the article.
Yes,
and
you did, yeah.
Pulling that all together, which gave over 450 results.
Yeah.
Now, because you're searching different databases, a lot of them are duplicates as well. So you go through the process of the duplicates. And then from there, you start to go further into your inclusion and exclusion criteria. So one of the things that was really important from my side was being really clear on the definition of a third culture kid. And there's so much crossover between expatriates, cross-cultural kids, international students, and even in articles that are talking about third culture kids, they define it in a slightly different way.
Yes.
And while on a personal level, I think that's really fascinating to look at all the different ways that we get of a similar experience. From a strictly research perspective, it's a little bit
a nightmare.
It's exactly what I was going to say.
Yeah.
It's a nightmare to sit through. And also a nightmare for trying to build further research off of it. Because
yes.
5 articles and they're all defining third culture kids separately.
Yeah.
How do I kind of further add on to the empirical knowledge?
Yeah.
So through the inclusion and exclusion criteria that I had, of also some basic ones of I can only really speak English and read English and write English to an academic level, where I can't do that in Spanish at this point. So the articles in English, and there was different exclusions criteria just based on that. And also looking at definitions of third culture kids. So after you go through all of that, and then looking at articles that actually are looking at identity and belonging, because they might be doing something, again, kind of adjacent to that. But from a research perspective, we really wanted it to be identity and belonging in terms of what it was addressing.
And hold on a second, for the and just to make it clear for the listener, so what you put into your search was, for example, third culture kid, third culture child, missionary kid, business kid, expatriate kid, military kid, children of missionaries, and it went on and on, right? You really had to do it very well to get all the information that you needed.
And again, I think that's another fascinating part of this research is we have nomadic children, business kids, and all these.
Yes.
I've even heard of Diplobrat, which
Diplobrats, yes.
Oh, that's a new one. That's a new one. Haven't heard that one. I will write that one down.
All these different ways of referring.
Oh my God, yeah.
And then depending on the perspective of research, they might kind of slightly define them differently. So there's just a lot of weeding through and trying to find the articles that were consistent enough for the purpose of this research. That doesn't mean I excluded aren't highly valuable. That's not the case at all. But for the purpose of what I was doing, it just needed to be quite focused on identity, belonging, and a clear definition of third culture kid.
So just to repeat the number, can you say your impressive numbers again? Like from which number you went down to which number?
I have it in front of me. Yeah, so I had an initial yield of 507 articles. Then I had 450 once the duplicates were removed. So we had over 50 duplicates. And then a bunch were screened. And we ended up with 6 in the end.
Wow.
Yeah.
Impressive.
And that goes also to the idea that the psychological or the research on third culture kids, because it doesn't necessarily have to come from a psychological perspective all the time, is a burgeoning field, and I mean that it's still very much in the burgeoning phase, right? And it's trying to figure out how to measure things, how to explain concepts, which concepts to do away with, which concepts to keep. So I think what you went through with this Prisma method definitely highlights that, Right. So you find these this total, once you've identified those 6 papers that are on the topic of identity and belonging, and they are very specifically rigorous in terms of their definition of third culture kids and all sorts of other aspects. My understanding is, and you can explain to us exactly what was the process. You were looking for broad, overarching themes emerging from the results of these studies. Were you doing so? Was it kind of an intuitive process? You were reading these papers and getting a sense of what was emerging from them and kind of organizing it in your mind?
Yeah, so there's a few different approaches to thematic analysis, but that's how I would describe more of the process that I went through this paper. A lot of it was kind of going through the results and the different findings that they'd had and almost trying to find the red thread between them. And then trying to identify a concept that kind of encapsulated that red thread. Which are challenging. And I think within thematic analysis, because of that, there's absolutely a subjective aspect to what we're talking about too. And that's very much a part of qualitative research overall as well. It was subjective, but that's really what I was going for, was looking through the results, trying to get an understanding of what is it that they're talking about, what are the similarities or the ones that are most talked about. And trying to find a category almost that they all kind of fit under, or
right.
red thread.
Yeah, so let's get into some of these themes. So that's only for now. Let's start with identity. Let's not talk about belonging, although I'm sure they're very much kind of conceptually related. But related to identity, the first theme you noticed emerging from the literature was something that you called identity negotiation. So what can you tell us about this concept? How should we How should we understand it? And what are the issues that the third culture kids seem to have around this thing that you call identity negotiation?
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of complex and also it's kind of a simple idea. And the idea is that basically third culture kids, from being in so many different kind of social and cultural contexts,
Mm-hmm.
develop a really acute sense of kind of understanding what is appropriate or the norms are of that social context or that cultural context or whatever
Mm.
context it be in. And as a part of trying to um, find that, and this is where it is very trickily connected to belonging and identity, through trying to find that belonging of a group or into a place or culture. What I saw in the research was that third culture kids were having to negotiate that, and so maybe changing different aspects of themselves to kind of suit the context that they were in,
Mm.
or really observing cultural and social norms of a particular context and then adapting to that and kind of taking that on as their own.
Mm.
So different instances of people, for example, changing their mannerisms and the way that they might have carried themselves. I think one really interesting part of research too is accent changes for third culture
Yes.
kids as
Yeah.
they kind of into different contexts. And so it's kind of that negotiation of understanding what the context requires and then trying to kind of meet that with their identity.
Mm.
Um, but it does seem to come from a sense of feeling a bit different, feeling a bit odd, wanting to be more a part of the context that they're in, and trying to do things that helps them fit into that. So I
Mm.
think that's really what we're understanding a little bit more about that identity negotiation that third culture kids might go through.
Right. Okay.
Mm.
Yeah. And the second theme you noticed was one that you called cultural multiplicity. Again, just by listening to the word, one can kind of come up with a kind of intuitive description of what that might mean. But what can you tell us about that? What do you mean by cultural multiplicity, and what are some of the issues related to that?
Yeah, so cultural multiplicity was really this idea that third culture kids seem to be kind of reporting how they take on multiple different cultures at
Mm,
once. And so not necessarily trying to be all into one culture or all into another, or thinking that um, when they're in the States, they need to be purely American, or when they're in Argentina, they need to be purely Argentinian. But this kind
Mm.
of sense of being able to hold multiple cultures at once, kind of despite.
Mm.
Um, and I really loved this one quote that I saw in an article that talked about having one identity, but I understanding both. And I think
right.
that's really what it's about, is
Yeah.
it's about kind of taking all of that on, but having it in a cohesive manner.
Yeah.
Um, and that kind of really touches on something that had previously been talked about in some of the identity literature with third culture kids, which was this idea that they were quite confused in
Yeah.
their identity.
You mentioned that. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that was really interesting for me to kind of toggle with as I was going through the research, because I was thinking it just doesn't really seem like that they're confused, because it seems like they're able to
Mm-hmm.
pinpoint which culture from where,
Yeah.
um, or which aspects of a certain culture, which aspects of a certain community within that culture that they then kind of take on as their own.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so it really kind of got me thinking in terms of how in a wider society are we constructing this idea of identity and constructing this idea of what it means to be a part of a culture. and how for third culture kids, it seems like they're kind of breaking through that social construction of understanding what it might be. You don't have to be Argentinian. You don't have to be American. You can be kind of this little cultural melting pot all in and of yourself in one. And I think that for people who aren't third culture kids, or maybe who aren't familiar with the lifestyle, or that kind of third culture overall, it can be quite confusing, because when we think about questions, where are you from? That's a really classic dreaded question.
Loaded question. Yeah.
But for many people, there's a really specific kind of understanding of that. And so I think what I thought I was starting to uncover a little bit in this literature was actually maybe that it's not as confusing for third culture kids. And that doesn't undermine that it can be a challenging process to navigate as you go, okay, hang on, taking aspects of this Iranian culture that I used to live in for a bit, but actually my parents' passport culture have nothing to do with this. So there is that complexity as you go about navigating all of that, but not necessarily confusion. And that perhaps maybe more of that confusion kind of lies in the tension between how third culture kids are and how we currently construct this idea of identity.
And I love what you said. Hold on a second, I'm going to quote you here. You said, on the basis that TCKs can clearly articulate their multicultural identities, it seems that TCKs are not confused by the unique blend, but perhaps it indicates that TCKs, you repeat, that are not culturally confused themselves, but only culturally confusing others, which I loved. Yeah, it's the interpretation, right?
Yeah, and it is, you know, if I try to really put myself in the perspective of someone who was born and raised in the same place, if someone asked me where I'm from, it'd be easy to answer that. And it would be odd to come across someone and go, well, hang on, how are you different cultures, but your passport has nothing to do with any of them?
Especially if you talk to a monocultural person who has a clear answer. I'm German and I live in Germany, and I come from I'm from Germany. I live in Germany. Very clear answer.
Yeah. So cultural multiplicity, very interesting. And then the third theme you noticed was called pervasive. I love this term. I think I'm gonna.
Me too. I love that expression.
Pervasive otherness from passport country. Let's talk about that. Sounds painful. Let's talk about that a little bit.
You know, I do think that this is possibly one of the more painful bits for third culture kids. I think in some ways, the identity negotiation bit can be a bit tricky at times, but it can also be seen as a superpower of sorts, of being able to kind of navigate lots of different contexts. And certainly for the articles that I reviewed for this literature and in other research that I've done, I hear the pride actually in third culture kids of having that multiplicity to them. But I think pervasive otherness from a passport country is where we start to get into something that's a little bit more painful and a little bit more tricky for third culture kids. And it felt important to kind of add that pervasiveness, because it just comes across as something that third culture kids can't quite get away from, despite maybe wanting. And certainly what I've seen in other research since the release of this article is that despite trying to use that negotiation to try and belong more to their passport country, there's still that feeling of otherness and difference, which is fascinating. So really here in the articles that I reviewed was this idea that they were just different and a bit from their passport country. And it was a bit confusing, I think, again, interesting that confusion coming in for people of their passport nation, because if you look, sound, for all intents and purposes, appear to be whatever of that nation. So if I'm an American, I appear, sound, look American, whatever. That's really confusing, that then I may not understand all the social and cultural nuances of that. And that's where that idea of a hidden immigrant, I think, is really kind of encapsulates actually what's going on. Of again, just for all appearances' sake, there's nothing that could indicate that you're not American, yet there's mismatch. There is a difference.
Exactly.
And I think one of the interesting descriptions that I did put into the article was this idea of kind of being an entertainingly exotic circus freak, of just kind of like so different. This is so unique.
And the weird kid, you also mentioned being the weird kid.
Yeah. And so I think this is something that third culture kids really feel. Part of the difficulty of it is that there is this sense of, because I think of that social construction that's going on, there's a sense of feeling like, well, I should feel like I'm a part of my passport country.
Right.
And in that expectation tension between kind of expectation and reality is where third culture kids are getting a little bit stuck and feeling that otherness.
Absolutely right.
That theme was getting at there.
And to add to that, there's well, at least from a personal anecdote, but I'm sure this will ring true for many. There's also an added emotional kind of factor to that, is that often people can feel almost a sense of resentment towards the country that they're supposed to be from. I know for myself, there was a sense of resentment towards Canada, because Canada was essentially the end of the adventure, or the place where I was supposed to be from. And I don't know this place. What are you saying? Why do you think I'm from here? So there's this aspect of resentment that I would suspect that if that emotion is not there, that might make the process a bit easier, not necessarily easy, but easier. But once you start adding these emotional, almost kind of moral judgments towards the country that you're and even it can get as bad as moral judgments towards the citizens of that country. I'm from this country, and these people are like this, and I don't like that, and over here they're all like this, and it can get quite dark.
I mean, it's interesting that you bring that up, because again, that's something that I put in the article. Is there was someone with an American passport, and they described that they started to develop this kind of anti-North American like sentiment and bitterness. And I think that's exactly what you're describing there. And it comes from that place of almost wanting to be and wishing in some sense, but also just really not clicking and not quite feeling it. Experiential level.
So and I've heard that also from the TCK girls I coach. I've heard that a few times. They have this icky feeling of being the weird, having this weird relationship with the passport country.
And in a big way, it really does make sense. It's much easier to be rejected from a country that you don't have any ties to. It would be much rejected if it was from Antarctica, and I'd be like, well, but I don't really have been. I don't really know. It would be very different. But it is painful.
So true.
All of your family is from there, and your parents might have also grown up there, and there is this sense of this kind of cultural cues and markers in your home, even abroad. So I think that is a culture, kids.
Shout out to Antarctica, by the way. We have many fans over there.
Oh, yes, we do. So these were the three themes that emerged from the research relating to identity. The next one would be belonging, right? And you found three as well. The first one was belonging everywhere and nowhere. Can you go a little bit into detail what you found?
Yeah, I cannot take pure credit for the development of that saying. That's a saying that is
Okay.
what culture kid world, this idea of belonging.
Yes.
But I couldn't help but see it in everything that was kind of being discussed in the articles. And really it's this idea of being able to adapt to pretty much any social, cultural kind of context, but not really quite feeling that sense of belonging.
Right.
Feel that kind of deeper, more meaningful connection. So that ability to kind of walk into a room, hold a conversation with people, maybe pick up on the fact that people took off their shoes before they entered the room, and be able to quite quickly pick up on that and adapt, and therefore kind of fit in and not stand out as that context, but still maybe not feel like they're able to form that more meaningful sense of belonging in that. And some people kind of described it as like an in-between state that I almost kind of picture of having one foot in one foot in the other, which is really interesting is in terms of trying to think a little bit about. But one of the other things that kind of came out in this everywhere or nowhere is again that idea of how are we constructing how we belong. And I think, again, when we think about that question of where are you from, we tend to think of places.
Right.
We think of geographical locations. And while that's very important, and I know third culture kids will find geographical locations to be very important, it was also interesting kind of seeing in the literature more of this idea of, because geographical locations become a little bit complex for third culture kids, it's almost easier to find it in the belonging in relationships and relationally. And so having a greater sense of a community that they belong to, or relationships that they feel a part of, as opposed to identifying with a specific place and feeling like they belong. And I think that was really interesting to kind of see come out in that sense of belonging everywhere and nowhere. And you can kind of see how that might go against our understanding of borders and all of that. If we're finding more of that belonging emotionally, then that could be anywhere. So I think
and you mentioned no, go ahead. Sorry, I cut. We already said it. It's like a little 2-3 second. Please finish. Please finish your sentence.
I was just saying. So I think all of those different aspects go into the idea of belonging everywhere and nowhere.
Yeah, and I like that you use the word of the multi-local sense of belonging. That sort of sums it up very nicely.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you already mentioned the second theme is like feeling at home with other cross-culture individuals, and then of course including TCKs, right? You put that as a separate theme.
Yeah. So I think one of the really interesting things for me was being able to identify third culture kids within a larger cross-cultural family. And again, it makes so much sense when we look at other migratory groups like children of immigrants or children of asylum seekers and things like that. What we often see is that children of immigrants will tend to kind of group and together and find a cultural community. And that there's this innate sense of kind of understanding cultural complexities and how they might be kind of going about navigating and have three in the mix, or more. So it was really interesting to start to see in the research that really coming through and going, actually, third culture kids are a part of a much bigger family of these kind of transnational multicultural experiences. and cross-cultural experiences. And simply by finding others who are also navigating cultures, doesn't necessarily have to be in a specific TCK way, but by finding, for example, children of immigrants or children of asylum seekers, or children of biracial and multicultural marriages, that sense of belonging can start to be found in this common foundation of navigating different cultures.
And also educational CCKs, right?
Yeah,
I think are very definitely belong into that category and can relate to TCKs, and the other way around.
Yeah, so I think this is also in the article of there was a third culture kid in one of the studies that I reviewed who ended up becoming really good friends with international students at the university. And again, that can kind of make sense. There's a lot of synergy.
Right.
They're not exactly the same, but you can see how they might have that immediate foundational understanding of being kind of new in this place, wherever they might be.
Definitely. And the third aspect that you mentioned is identifying as a TCK can be itself a sort of home, right?
Yeah, yeah. And this is where the me search
comes in.
And that's not something that I meant to find, but was actually that I had afterwards of going, yeah, that sounds like me. And I kind of talked about it earlier in the podcast actually too, of there's something about the simple education and learning of third culture kids and identifying and understanding that they belong to a larger group, that they are not a weird kid in isolation, but that there's a bunch of others who have very similar experiences as them that they can also relate to. So I think there is really quite moving excerpts and quotes from different participants in that I reviewed of talking about this process of just being so elated to find out that a third culture kid was a thing to begin with. Simple identification with it brought about this sense of belonging to another group. And again, I think that's where keeping in mind this idea of like a hidden immigrant can be really helpful from the perspective of imagine if an immigrant didn't know that they were an immigrant, and that's trying to navigate all these different cultural mishaps and differences and things like that without having that context in the back of their mind of going, well, I'm really not really supposed to understand it yet. I'm still acculturating to the place that I'm trying to be part of. And I think that some third culture kids are just trying to navigate all this blindly, not knowing that actually it makes sense that you're going through that. And the reason that it makes sense is because actually there's this whole thing about being a third culture kid of up and how that might mean that you've missed out on some of your passport culture, for example, or you might have missed out trying to be a part of. So that I think that was a big part. It's again going back to that word of validation is what it seemed like culture kids.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because you often hear people say, well, I don't want another label when receiving some sort of diagnosis or something.
Definitely.
And in a sense, TCK is a label. It's not a diagnosis because it's not a mental condition or psychological condition, but it is a label. And I have heard stories of parents who are trying to help their TCK children say, look, you're a TCK. And the kids say, I don't want a label. And I'm wondering, I'm just pointing that out and seeing how interesting that is, that at the same time that it can be a home for some, you can have some people who will almost rebel against it,
Yes.
at least for a time. Perhaps in a particular phase of their life, they might come around to it later on and go, you know what, mom was kind of right. I am a TCK. Does that trigger any thoughts in your mind at all, Chloe?
Yeah, you know what? The second that you mentioned that, I was immediately thinking about that from a developmental perspective. And my background is in child development as well.
Right.
So when I think about that idea of kind of rejecting different parts of identity and kind of rejecting different labels, I'm really thinking of that adolescent period. And not connected to this specific article, but to other experiences that I've had as a professional and working with third culture kids. You do see that in adolescence, specifically when they're still in the third culture. When you're still within that third culture of, perhaps it's an international school, for example, you're not yet quite toggling with this idea of being different because you're in the same community. It's once you leave that community, which tends to be when you're older, although some people repatriate at a younger age and navigate this much sooner. I think that's where the idea of kind of being able to identify it might become more as a home. Because I think, interestingly, is this idea that people don't really know that they are a third culture kid, and you do kind of grow up like any other kid, thinking that
any other third culture kid.
Yeah, you think that your experience is like everyone else's experience, and you see that it's all the time, is that if I'm growing up as a third culture kid, you look at your cousin in Canada and go, well, surely you get it too. Like, this is exactly what you and so there's not necessarily that need to kind of have that sense of belonging. You could also take a developmental perspective on how you find belonging throughout the lifespan too, which would be really interesting.
And you just mentioned repatriation. I mean, for many TCKs, it is no repatriation. They're just going to a country that's their passport country where they haven't lived before. There's no in doing this. It's for them, it's the first time. It's patriation. It's the first time for them, right? And very often, that's a hard one. That's a hard move. You've experienced that, right? When you went back to the States to study for high school, you said,
it was for my undergraduate. My bachelor's, first time I'd ever lived in the States. But again, I think you and I've seen again this in research, and I have that personal experience of myself of growing up. I'd never really thought too much about where I'm from. I'd just say, oh, I'm American Venezuelan, and kind of like leave it as that. And I didn't realize the impact of that until moving to the States and going, oh, maybe I'm not American. Like, I don't know what they're about. I don't know what they're referencing. And all the little like sayings and different pop cultural references. And I was like, oh, maybe I'm not. So yeah, the repatriation is a really interesting time for third culture kids. And I think that it can be a really turbulent time for third culture kids.
Definitely.
Have you encountered any unexpected findings during this research, or were you surprised by anything, or did pretty much everything seemed expected?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think actually for me it was going back to that idea of how much empowerment can come from the idea of simply learning about their culture might be. I do think that I personally took for granted coming from that perspective of my parents always knew what their culture kids were. And so though I didn't have much personal interest in it growing up, I always had that as a point of reference. Whereas in doing the research, I think I can fully appreciate that most people don't. And so I think there's a huge, and that's why I love what this podcast is doing too. There's a huge reason to really push for simply just raising awareness, sharing information, getting it out there, and a bit more normalized. Because I think what I see in my private practice is when I'm meeting with different clients for counseling and therapy is almost this coming from this perspective of something's wrong with me.
Right.
Yes, definitely.
Instead of this idea, so I spend so much of our work really normalizing actually painful human experience of what it means to maybe and how it's completely understandable.
Yeah.
A lot of it. So I think really sharing that kind of education aspect of it so that people can start to know that they are a TCK, know that they do have that sense of belonging, that there are unique experiences that come with it. I think that's really powerful. And I think that was kind of surprising for me to become more opened up to, just given my personal context of a little bit.
Right. Yeah. Definitely. And how do you think that the results that sort of emerged from your study could be used to help the TCK or expat family, let's say? Because we're including, I mean, the knowledge should go also to the parents, right?
Parents
Educating it. So, and you, on a personal question, do you only work with the kids or do you include the parents as well?
Anytime you work with kids, it's important to work with parents.
Yes. I can only agree.
And I know it's not always possible. And I know that even in 2024, there's stigma around going to something's wrong with you, which is not the case at all. And I think I can completely appreciate how, as a parent, it might feel as though if you have to go into a session that something's wrong with you or that you've done something wrong and therefore there's a lot of shame.
As a parent?
Oh, yeah.
Exactly.
Oh God, you send your child to therapy, now you have to go as well. Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Right?
And I can completely appreciate that because it's such a vulnerable position to be in. But also just so important. We're human, we exist in connection, we exist in systems, even more so as children and adolescents. And so it is really important to have that parent involvement. And that's a huge key finding in another piece of research that I've been doing, or I've done now. So that is hugely important in working with the system around it. But I think in terms of this research and this literature review, I really hope that it's used as a tool to normalize and to that actually, though you might hear a lot of judgments and criticisms about why has your accent changed, that actually many do change their accents and that's okay. Or when at big extended family gatherings and family reunions, why you feel a bit on the periphery and how that's just a bit of an odd experience for you, and actually going,
that's normal.
And this is what happens. This is part of what we try to navigate. So really, hopefully, utilizing this as a way of kind of self-validation, normalizing the experiences that you're going through in your identity and belonging.
And of course, there are, you do also point to some of the limits of the research on identity and belonging in third culture kids. We've already alluded to part of it when we talked about the problems of definitions, right? This idea that if there are definitions and different definitions of what it is to be third culture kids in different papers, then different people get included to participate, and then you're not sure how it can be kind of generalized or seen from the same perspective. But you also point to other interesting limitations of the current research, and of course, limitations are an invitation for future researchers to basically do more research. One of it is that you mentioned that there's rarely the intersectional aspect of a TCK is really taken into account. Things like other categories, basically, than TCK, someone's gender, someone's ethnic background, and so on. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So if we're looking at intersectional aspects of identity in particular, we're thinking about your racial identity, ethnic identity, sexuality, nationality, gender. I mean, so many different things that go into it. And I think I can kind of see, or I can imagine what's probably happened with the research is that if we're seeing third culture kids is coming from a third culture that is a culture in and of itself, that we might not take the time to kind of take a step back and explore how other cultures could be interacting with the third culture, for example.
Yes. Yeah.
Or if within the third culture, as third culture kids, we know no bounds in terms of race identity or ethnic identity. Third culture kids can look like anyone, any language, and this is really rare for cultures, and communities. Usually things that identify us is there's a phenotype, or there's a language, or a religious belief of some sort that ties the community together. But for third culture, we don't have any of this. So I can really understand why, from a research perspective, we've kind of left that off of our radar.
I see.
I think it's really important to bring it back in, because actually the experiences of a Black third culture kid growing up in the third culture in a very white Europe kind of background, very different experiences than a white third culture kid growing up in a European upbringing. And these are really important factors when we're trying to understand more about the psychology and more about the interpersonal relatedness. If we're a Black third culture kid in the Ukraine, we're going to have a very different way of relating to our surroundings than a white third culture kid in the Ukraine.
Or even a white third culture kid, for example, in South America. Different level field.
Yeah, so all of these intersections are really important, I think, in considering. And when we're thinking about it from an identity perspective too, we might not only be navigating the third culture, but if we're coming from a multicultural marriage where maybe father is Indian and mother is Kiwi, those are other multiple layers that are adding into our identity as to make it all up. And I can see take longer for people to kind of understand and come to terms with their identity when there's these other intersectional factors. So I think it is really important for research to start to understand these nuances and almost different communities of the third culture. And I think, just like you've said there, to understanding the context for that third culture kid, of what that might exactly look like and how that identity intersects with the context that they grew up in, countries that they grew up in. So I think those are really important areas to kind of be considering within third culture kid research, because so far we're kind of making the assumption that they're all the same from a perspective, and that's not necessarily. It's an incredibly diverse culture with so many different religions, languages, and ethnic identities and races.
Agreed. Yeah.
Yeah.
Andrea, you want to take us out with the last question?
Yes. Although I think Chloé might have answered it already.
I kind of feel it too. Yeah.
Let me read it out, because the last one, number 8, would have been, what's the one thing you feel isn't being talked about enough? Is there still something left?
There's definitely the intersectionality side, which I feel pretty interested in. But I think also, I am a psychologist. So, and like I said in the beginning, kind of going full circle in the podcast, is this research was developed for the purpose of building on top of it from a psychology perspective. And there's not a lot out there on how growing up this way impacts the psychology and the mental health and psychological well-being of someone. So I think that's really important to kind of delve further into as a research. I think we do owe it to third culture kids. I mean, it's quite a big number. There's not really a grasp on how big the population is, but it's only going to get bigger with increased globalization. So I think we really do owe it to families, to the children and adolescents who are growing up in this way. Also interesting to think about it from an employer's perspective when they're families overseas. How does it impact someone's well-being? And we know in non-third culture kid populations, well-being can impact everything from academic outcomes to future predictions in terms of professional success and all of it. So I think it's really important to start having a better understanding of that. So
much agreed.
Yes, very much agreed. And especially on the employer side, because you have clients, I have clients, they are struggling with something because there is a reason, and yet employers are not taking care of that. They're barely taking care of their employees, but not of their families, I must say, unless it's military kids and missionary kids, I would say. I don't know from your perspective, but they're doing a really good job of preparing, debriefing, compared to other global national organizations who just send their people out into the world with their families. Care, like I say, about the employee in a sense of, and I even would put caring here into quotation marks. But the family just moves along, and I wish they would care a little bit more.
I do think there's an argument that could be made for the ethics behind employers moving families overseas without
definitely.
I think it's a wonderful lifestyle, and I don't at all, across any of my research, mean to kind of doom and gloom it, because I think there's lots of pros to it, but I think it's essential that the systems that are kind of creating the culture, the third culture kids and expatriates and things like that, that also have a responsibility to support them and understand how these experiences can impact them, because they're difficult to navigate.
I don't know if I remember, I don't know if it's still done, but I remember my very, very early days when we went over from, I met my husband here in Mexico, then we went over to Asia I'm giving my age away, 1995. And
we can edit that part out.
Edit that out. And the big oil companies then gave hardship bonuses to people in different postings. So Jakarta was one where we were, there was no hardship bonus, let me tell you. Different parts in Indonesia as well, and then Asian countries, depending on what it was, hardship bonuses. So there was sign of a kind of knowledge that it wasn't easy. I would be interested if anybody of the listeners would comment on if there's still hardship bonuses. I've never seen one. Are they still out there? I don't know.
But the solution was financial. Is that what you're saying? That basically
the solution
to that difficulty was financial only. Yeah. Interesting.
But at least it was acknowledged in some part.
Sure.
I think maybe nowadays with it being more prominent and being more widely used and accepted, it's even pushed under swept under the carpet. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I don't have much connection actually to the business side of things in terms of what's going on as much. My background personally is much more from the educational system.
Yeah.
I don't remember my parents kind of speaking about any of that.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I think there's a lot of interesting factors to consider behind the idea of a hardship post and how that might frame things for a family. And also, yeah, where that might be coming from on a wider social justice kind of context too, of thinking about what is it about certain nations and posts that kind of evoke that. And I think that's a really interesting question too, of it, the solution being financial.
Yeah,
is fascinating as well.
It says a lot.
Yeah.
Let me just tell you, they got an extra flight. We only got one flight a year. I think they got two.
They got an extra one. Yes,
back home.
Okay.
Yeah, so I don't know if it's still going on, but it would be interesting to
hear.
Right. Yeah. So Chloé, you've done a wonderful work with this paper, and I think what comes out of it is definitely all the themes that we mentioned, but also the need to continue this research. We'd like to thank you very much for coming on board this young and fledgling TCK podcast. We know that it's I think you're 6 hours ahead of me in terms of time, probably, or 5 hours if you're in the UK. And so it's getting later in the day for you. And so any last words that you would like to leave the listeners with?
No, I don't think so. I feel like we've had a really enriching conversation. And genuinely, I'm so excited to see podcasts like this coming up. And just the more that knowledge can be disseminated about the third culture kid experience, I think is just music to my ears. It's amazing.
Agreed. Yeah. Well, thank you for that.
Thanks for saying that. Yeah.
All right. Well, we'll leave it here, folks. We'll see you in the next episode.
Number 4 coming up soon.
Number 4 coming up soon. Goodbye, Chloé. Thanks.
Bye. Thank you so much, Chloé.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the TCK Research Podcast. We hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as we did. Please subscribe, like, and share our podcast and leave us a review. It really helps others find us. If you have any questions or comments, please write to us at tckresearchpod@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you, and we promise we'll answer all emails. We wish you a good day wherever you are, and we hope you'll join us again for the next episode.